No foreign aid, no IMF loans. Yet one of the world's poorest nations just launched a $200 billion road project, 10 times its entire GDP. While the world wasn't watching, Burkina Faso quietly began paving a future no one thought possible. And now everyone is asking, where did the money come from, and how is this even real? While most nations were busy negotiating new loans, restructuring old debts, and pleading with international donors for development aid, something extraordinary happened in the heart of West Africa. Burkina Faso, a landlocked country with one of the lowest GDPs per capita in the world, announced the unthinkable, a $200 billion infrastructure project, fully funded, fully sovereign, and completely independent of the IMF or the World Bank. It wasn't a fantasy, it wasn't a political slogan, it was concrete, asphalt, engineering maps, and bulldozers already at work. The world didn't know how to react. Headlines hesitated, analysts fumbled for explanations, economists quietly whispered behind closed doors. How did they do it? Because if Burkina Faso could pull this off, it would not just build roads, it would tear apart the foundation of the entire global financial order. For decades, the IMF has been the gatekeeper of development finance. Countries like Burkina Faso were told they could not grow without foreign aid, that their own revenues were insufficient, that they must privatize, liberalize, and compromise to qualify for loans. They were treated like permanent students, never trusted, never believed, always corrected. But this time the script was flipped. Under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso didn't just reject new IMF loans, it rejected the entire model. And in its place, it built something no one expected, an economy rooted in internal strength, regional cooperation, and absolute political will. The announcement came in phases. First, a statement from the Ministry of Infrastructure outlining a national road modernization plan that would span more than 10,000 kilometers, connecting every major city, rural town, and economic corridor. Then, detailed blueprints of highways, bridges, logistics hubs, and smart toll systems, all drawn up not by foreign consultants, but by a newly created task force of Burkinabe engineers, planners, and economists. And finally, the revelation that stunned even insiders. The project's estimated cost, $200 billion, would be financed without a single dollar in external debt. The question, of course, was immediate and urgent. Where was the money coming from? How could a country with a GDP of just $20 billion under sanctions, with limited exports, suddenly find 10 times its national output to pour into infrastructure? The answer, it turned out, was both simple and revolutionary. Over the past year, Traoré's administration had quietly nationalized key mining operations, tightened control over gold exports, and implemented a sovereign wealth mechanism that redirected resource revenues into a closed-loop investment system. Every ounce of gold exported by Burkina Faso now passed through a state-controlled structure. Profits that once vanished into offshore accounts and foreign-owned mining corporations were now redirected into domestic infrastructure funds. Leaks were sealed. Corruption was hunted. Middlemen were cut. The money that had always been there, hidden, diverted, wasted, was finally working for the people. But that wasn't the full picture. Alongside financial reforms, Traoré launched a parallel social campaign to mobilize local industries. Thousands of young Burkinabe were trained in road construction, civil engineering, logistics, and heavy machinery operation. Instead of importing labor or relying on international contractors, the project became a national employment engine. Local factories began producing bricks, tiles, cement, and steel. What Burkina Faso couldn't manufacture, it bartered for, using its gold reserves to secure direct deals with friendly nations in Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. No loans, no interest, just trade. The result was a development model unlike anything seen before in West Africa, radical, patriotic, and unapologetically defiant. And the world began to take notice. The initial skepticism from the international community quickly turned into quiet alarm. For decades, Burkina Faso had been ranked near the bottom of every development index, used as a textbook example of a country that needed the IMF, foreign aid, and Western development models. And yet now it had not only rejected those models, It was outperforming them. While other countries waited months for loan approvals and budget reviews from Washington or Brussels, Burkina Faso was laying down roads at a speed that stunned observers. Drones recorded construction stretching across entire regions. Trucks delivered material day and night. School children in remote areas who had never seen a paved road watched as smooth asphalt reach their doorsteps. And with every kilometer completed, the country sent a silent message: we don't need permission to develop. What made this even more disruptive was that the entire project was structured to retain value within the country. The toll systems installed along major highways weren't being operated by multinational corporations. They were owned by regional cooperatives and managed by state-trained youth. Revenue from tolls went directly back into road maintenance and local development funds. For the first time in living memory, people saw infrastructure not as a gift from abroad, but as something they had built, owned, and benefited from directly. This psychological shift was enormous. In villages where the IMF's presence had once meant austerity and cuts, now there was progress, investment, and national pride. The story of roads became the story of resistance. Resistance to a system that had told Burkina Faso to wait, to beg, to compromise. And at the center of it all stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, not as a distant bureaucrat, but as a leader who visited construction sites in boots and a uniform, who spoke not in technocratic jargon, but in the language of dignity. In one widely shared moment, captured on national television, Traoré stood before a crowd of workers and said, "They told us we were too poor to dream, but we were only too poor to obey. We stopped obeying, and look at what we're building." That sentence rippled through the continent. It was more than a quote. It was a declaration of war against dependency, a rallying cry for every African nation suffocating under the weight of conditional loans and unkept promises. In response, the IMF and its allies didn't issue statements. They issued silence. But behind that silence came action. Policy advisors began warning partner nations about the risks of engaging too closely with Burkina Faso. Trade credits were quietly tightened. Aid programs were slowed or frozen under administrative review. International news outlets began running stories questioning the transparency of the road project, hinting at corruption, environmental concerns, and the lack of foreign oversight. But inside Burkina Faso, none of that mattered. The roads were real, the jobs were real, the pride was real, and the people were watching, not foreign newspapers, but the changing face of their own country. For the first time, rural farmers could transport their goods to urban markets in a single day. Pregnant women in isolated regions could reach hospitals in hours instead of days. Schools received supplies, clinics received medicine, and local businesses saw traffic that once flowed only in the capital. The roads were more than infrastructure. They were arteries of liberation. And with every kilometer, the old logic of debt, dependence, and delay crumbled. But the question still lingered. How long could this last? Would the global system tolerate a country proving that independence was not only possible, but more effective? What Burkina Faso was doing could not be dismissed as luck or anomaly. It was strategic rebellion. A country once dismissed as economically irrelevant was now becoming a case study in post-aid development, not through theory, but through sheer execution. And as the roads extended, so did something more dangerous to the established global system, a narrative that Africans could build for themselves without supervision. Regional leaders began taking notice. Delegations from Mali, Niger, and Guinea visited Burkina Faso to study its model firsthand. They didn't come for photo ops. They came with engineers, economists, and legal experts. What they found wasn't just about asphalt and bridges, but a state that had embraced a philosophy of resource protection and circular investment. Every mining site was now monitored by a state-controlled drone network. Every contract with foreign entities had to be approved by an interministerial review board that included local civil society observers. A new law required that at least 70% of all infrastructure labor be locally sourced. Another law mandated that any foreign company operating in strategic sectors must establish a training program for Burkinabe nationals. And yet, even with these restrictions, interest from abroad didn't fade. It intensified. Because behind the scenes, some nations admired what Traoré had achieved. In a world where resource wars and economic crises were becoming the norm, a stable, self-funded model, even if controversial, was valuable. Russia, Turkey, and Brazil expressed willingness to trade materials in exchange for Burkina Faso's surplus gold reserves, avoiding the dollar entirely. Iran offered engineering advisors. Indonesia proposed barter agreements involving palm oil, rice, and equipment. What was forming was not just a road network, but an economic insurgency against Western financial dominance. Still, not everyone at home was ready for the consequences. A quiet political resistance began to surface. Some former officials, many of whom had prospered under IMF-backed regimes, warned that the current path was reckless. They argued that Burkina Faso risked diplomatic isolation, technological stagnation, and eventual collapse. Western NGOs echoed these fears, speaking of a shrinking civil space, of concerns over press freedom, of increasing state power. But the government, rather than dismissing criticism, invited it publicly. In a move that shocked both supporters and skeptics, Traoré held a national forum broadcast live, where opposition leaders, community activists, journalists, and students were invited to debate the government's direction. No moderator, no censorship. For 5 hours, the nation watched as citizens interrogated power face to face. The result? Not chaos, not collapse, but legitimacy. Because while Burkina Faso was challenging the IMF, it was also proving it could govern itself transparently. That legitimacy translated into further momentum. As new roads neared completion, the state launched a digital toll management system that sent daily revenue reports to a public dashboard. Every citizen could now track where money from infrastructure went, how much was collected, which projects it funded, and which companies were awarded contracts. This level of visibility made corruption harder, criticism easier, and accountability inevitable. And yet, as successful as the model appeared, the threat was still present. Not through bombs or invasions, but through markets. Credit access tightened. Insurance companies raised premiums on Burkinabe shipments. International investors began blacklisting local firms, claiming uncertain political risk. It was an invisible war waged through spreadsheets and boardrooms. And in this war, Burkina Faso would need more than concrete. It would need unity, because the storm was only beginning to form, and the system it had defied was just starting to fight back. The backlash was not a surprise to anyone in Traoré's inner circle. They had studied the history of nations that dared to resist financial colonialism. They knew that silence from the IMF meant coordination elsewhere. They understood that isolation wouldn't come with bombs, but with capital starvation, travel restrictions, and narrative warfare. So they moved first. Burkina Faso established a sovereign economic emergency task force, not to panic, but to predict. The task force mapped every possible point of foreign leverage, from import dependencies and trade choke points to software licenses and satellite access. Then they began unplugging. Government IT systems were migrated to open-source platforms hosted on locally secured servers. National currency reserves were diversified. Gold, regional currencies, and barter credits replaced dollar-heavy dependency. Cross-border trade agreements were signed with neighboring Sahel states using bilateral clearing mechanisms. A Pan-African logistics hub was initiated in Ouagadougou, designed to reroute West African exports through cooperative-owned infrastructure instead of foreign-managed ports. The message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso would not be kneecapped by old tools. And as these moves played out, the construction continued. Not just highways, but feeder roads linking remote agricultural zones to regional trade routes. Bridges that turned rainy season isolation into year-round access. Solar-lit rest stops with water stations and emergency medical aid posts. This wasn't just about movement, it was about dignity. A mother in Topoa could now travel to a city hospital without praying for the rain to stop. A farmer in Tuibara could sell vegetables in Bobo Dioulasso without relying on middlemen who took half the profit. These were not abstractions, they were daily transformations. And the people responded. In ceremonies once reserved for political rallies, communities began holding what they called road Thanksgivings. Elders, children, merchants, and masons gathered under tents. not to praise a man, but to bless the ground itself. Some wept, not because the roads were beautiful, but because they had waited decades and finally they had arrived. But progress does not erase danger. Behind the scenes, attempts to destabilize the movement intensified. Anonymous smear campaigns painted Traoré as a military dictator masquerading as a reformer. Foreign media fixated on protests, magnifying minor incidents to portray chaos. Satellite data from foreign agencies were quietly used to monitor the movement of construction materials, looking for ways to disrupt supply chains. Still, the government adapted. It began rotating procurement contracts among regional suppliers to prevent single points of failure. Strategic stockpiles of fuel, asphalt, and steel were established in secured inland zones. A civilian protection program was launched to train local communities in safeguarding infrastructure. Hundreds of volunteers signed up to monitor roadworks, report sabotage, and mediate land disputes before they escalated. The revolution had become participatory. It was no longer Traoré's vision alone. It was embedded in the daily routines of millions. The roads were becoming symbols of something deeper: control over time. For the first time, journeys that once took days now took hours. Goods moved faster. People moved farther. Ideas moved freer. And with every acceleration, Burkina Faso inched further from the IMF's narrative that development must be borrowed. Yet the global response was becoming desperate. Reports emerged that regional trade forums were being pressured to suspend Burkina Faso's membership. Multilateral lenders offered backdoor packages to opposition figures. Think tanks labeled the country increasingly erratic, but none of it slowed the momentum. Because when a nation has seen itself move, literally, there is no going back. They had touched the road. They had driven on it. They had built it. And they would defend it, not just with words, but with will. As the rest of the world scrambled to interpret what was unfolding in Burkina Faso, the people on the ground no longer waited for outside validation. They had become the architects of their own momentum. In towns and cities, communities began setting up development watches, local groups that tracked progress, documented challenges, and held officials accountable not through protest but through participation. Civil engineers began training apprentices directly on site. Schools adjusted their schedules to allow students to visit construction areas and learn about infrastructure in real time. In effect, the road project had become the country's largest classroom. What the IMF had once called too ambitious was now a living syllabus. But ambition alone doesn't fill potholes. So the government doubled its efforts. A road maintenance corps was established, made up of trained local teams assigned to specific stretches of highway with full responsibility for upkeep. Their salaries were paid through toll revenue, not from external grants. Performance reviews were public. Bonuses were tied to efficiency and durability, and the results were astonishing. Repairs that used to take months under foreign contractors were now resolved in days. Asphalt quality improved. Drainage systems were redesigned using local knowledge of seasonal floods. Even emergency lanes were lined with digital sensors to alert nearby stations in case of accidents. Burkina Faso wasn't just building roads, it was building systems. And these systems started attracting attention from unlikely places. Delegations from Kenya, Bolivia, and even parts of Southeast Asia arrived quietly to study how a low-income country under sanctions had turned resource wealth into logistical strength without falling into debt traps. They left not with contracts, but with blueprints, mental and material. But as admiration grew, so did external pressure. An anonymous leak revealed that certain financial institutions were planning to downgrade Burkina Faso's economic outlook, not based on default risk, but on political unpredictability. The rating would make international insurance more expensive, imports harder, and global partnerships riskier. It was a familiar tactic: kneecap the country by isolating its economy through bureaucracy. But the government anticipated the move. It announced a resilience fund backed by domestic gold earnings, capable of underwriting insurance gaps and currency shocks. Meanwhile, local media ran public education campaigns explaining what the downgrade meant and how the country would counter it. Transparency became defense. And through that defense, trust grew. But not everyone inside the country shared that trust. Former elites, those sidelined by Traoré's nationalization policies, began forming political coalitions. Some launched new parties, others courted foreign support with promises of reform. They argued that Burkina Faso's new direction was unsustainable, that isolation was dangerous, and that IMF cooperation would bring stability. These narratives, amplified by foreign think tanks and Western NGOs, gained traction among urban professionals whose livelihoods had once depended on donor-driven projects. The country stood at a psychological crossroads between a future it could shape or a past it could re-enter. Traoré responded not with force, but with challenge. In a televised address, he said, "If the old way worked, we would not be here. If begging built roads, we'd be a highway nation by now. We are not disrespecting history, we are correcting it." That speech cut through the noise. It was replayed in taxis, in classrooms, in markets. Not because it was elegant, but because it was true. People didn't need theories. They needed travel, trade, and trust. And they were finally getting all three. The country was still vulnerable, but it was no longer voiceless. And that made all the difference. Because the world could pressure a government, but it could not pressure a people who had already felt the asphalt beneath their feet and knew it belonged to them. As Burkina Faso pushed forward with its monumental infrastructure revolution, something remarkable began to happen. Not in the capital, not in policy rooms, but in the collective imagination of the people. For the first time in generations, development no longer felt like a foreign word. It felt familiar, local, tangible. School teachers began using the road network as a metaphor for personal ambition. Start somewhere, go far. Musicians composed songs about the roads, not just praising their length or smoothness, but what they represented: freedom, connection, and the end of waiting. Local entrepreneurs set up roadside stalls, gas stations, mechanic shops, and small-scale hotels in regions that were once cut off by terrain. Rural youth who had once dreamed only of migrating to cities now found purpose right where they were. The road had not just brought movement, it had reversed direction. And yet, not all eyes that watched this transformation were friendly. International corporations that had previously dominated West African logistics began to lose market share as Burkina Faso's regional trade corridors shifted. Port fees declined. Third-party freight firms lost contracts to newly created state cooperative transport alliances. The shockwaves rippled beyond borders. This wasn't just a national project anymore. It was continental disruption. Quietly, Western-backed trade lobbies began lobbying for sanctions, not direct but disguised. Accusations were filed in international courts claiming that Burkina Faso's nationalization of its mineral supply chain violated investor protection clauses in old agreements. Frozen assets were requested, lawsuits were prepared. But Traoré's legal team had prepared too. Months earlier, Burkina Faso had withdrawn from specific arbitration treaties and created a sovereign legal council that reviewed every economic agreement for exploitative clauses. Foreign firms now had to negotiate on equal terms or walk away. And many did. They underestimated how far the country was willing to go to protect its sovereignty. But the price was real. Some crucial technologies, like specialized road sensors and imported cement additives, became harder to source. International payments slowed as financial networks treated the country as high risk. Travel restrictions were quietly introduced, targeting key government officials and partners. Still, the momentum did not break. It adapted. A wave of innovation emerged from necessity. Local scientists at the University of Ouagadougou developed new asphalt blends using native materials that withstood Sahel heat better than imported alternatives. Solar-powered traffic signals were invented by high school robotics teams and deployed along rural routes. Villagers experimented with recycled materials to reinforce road shoulders, guided by engineers live streaming instructions from laptops. The road was no longer a government project. It had become a national obsession, a movement. And like all powerful movements, it began reshaping identity. Burkinabe flags were painted on toll booths. School uniforms featured road safety symbols. Even currency designs were proposed featuring iconic bridges and highways. The country wasn't just building infrastructure, it was weaving a story about itself, one that had never been told before. Not about survival, not about dependence, but about design, determination, and dignity. But amid this celebration, the risk of sabotage remained ever present. Railway segments being built to connect with Mali were briefly vandalized. A warehouse storing road materials in the Est region was set on fire under mysterious circumstances. No one claimed responsibility. No arrests were made. But everyone understood. The road was not just concrete, it was confrontation. A direct challenge to a world order that had long dictated who gets to build and who waits for permission. Burkina Faso had stopped waiting, and in doing so, it had become a mirror to the continent and a warning to the world. As Burkina Faso's roads stretched farther across the nation's vast and often forgotten terrains, it became increasingly clear that this was no longer just about infrastructure. It was about rewriting the social contract. The country was changing not just physically, but philosophically. What had started as a resistance to foreign economic domination had evolved into a blueprint for participatory governance. Every road segment completed was paired with public accounting forums. Communities were invited to review expenditures, inspect timelines, and suggest improvements. Citizens who had once feared approaching government buildings were now standing with spreadsheets and questions, knowing they had the right to know. And the government responded, not with suppression, but with structure. Traoré's administration passed the Road Transparency and Equity Act, which made it legally mandatory for all major public works to publish itemized budgets accessible via SMS or online. If a bridge cost more than the projected amount, the explanation had to be made public. If a section of road was delayed, citizens had the right to file inquiries without legal risk. This radical transparency didn't just silence critics, it turned former skeptics into guardians. Elders who had once denounced politics as distant nonsense began volunteering as construction monitors. Youth who had previously vandalized public buildings were now designing them. The revolution had entered the bloodstream of the nation, but the world outside continued its campaign of subtle containment. Journalists who visited Burkina Faso were often briefed beforehand by embassies in neighboring countries, warned to look deeper for hidden authoritarianism. Editorials framed the infrastructure miracle as a mask for deeper instability. Phrases like road populism and asphalt autocracy began appearing in foreign policy circles. And yet, each critique seemed to strengthen local support. Because for once, the Burkinabe people didn't need someone else to interpret their reality. They could see it, touch it, drive on it. The roads didn't just reduce travel time, they stretched imagination. A teacher in a remote village could now receive lab equipment within days, not months. A mother could reach prenatal care before complications turned fatal. A trader could ship her goods, return home the same day, and plan for tomorrow. These weren't promises. They were changes. Still, resistance persisted. Intelligence agencies reported increased chatter from external actors exploring regime change scenarios. Currency speculators began shorting the West African CFA franc, hoping to induce panic that would ripple into the Burkinabe banking system. Opposition figures, some genuine, others opportunistic, called for international intervention, citing economic uncertainty and political rigidity. But Traoré didn't flinch. He did something few expected. He offered an early national referendum, not on his presidency, but on the country's development model itself. The ballot asked a simple question: should Burkina Faso continue its sovereign infrastructure and financial independence path, even if it means isolation from traditional partners? The answer was overwhelming. Over 82% voted yes. In rural regions, turnout surpassed 90%. It was a democratic roar against dependency. No tanks, no coups, just a box, a ballot, and a decision. That referendum silenced many foreign critics, temporarily. But it also exposed the real fear gripping Western institutions. Not that Burkina Faso would fail, but that it was succeeding on its own terms. Because if a nation as small, landlocked, and historically impoverished as Burkina Faso could mobilize internal resources, reject debt traps, and still build a modern state, then the excuses holding back dozens of other nations might collapse. And with them, so might the system built on those excuses. The world had long believed that only it could build, But now Burkina Faso was proving otherwise, with every bridge, every road, and every citizen who refused to be told wait. What Burkina Faso had unleashed was no longer confined to blueprints or budgets. It had become a movement of minds. The roads had connected more than villages and cities. They had connected identity to ambition, and ambition to possibility. The once marginalized nation was no longer just building infrastructure, it was building a narrative that challenged the very foundation of how development had been defined for a continent. That narrative reached beyond borders. In university halls across West Africa, students debated the Burkina Faso model. In market stalls in Togo, vendors spoke of how goods now arrive faster because of cross-border links developed by their neighbor. In African Union sessions, quiet glances were exchanged among officials asking the same unspoken question. If they can do it, why can't we? But for every ally inspired, a rival emerged threatened. International financial institutions began tightening regional credit flows, making it more difficult for other Sahel countries to replicate the Burkina Faso strategy. Influential think tanks warned that unchecked infrastructure nationalism could destabilize West African monetary policy. The World Bank issued a report with veiled language, suggesting that non-aligned infrastructure investment often led to systemic risk. These phrases meant only one thing. Burkina Faso had become too independent. It wasn't just resisting the old order, it was replacing it with something the old order couldn't control. Inside the country, however, the response to this pressure was not fear, it was acceleration. A National Institute for Infrastructure Sovereignty was established to train a new generation of planners, engineers, and economists grounded in local needs and ethics. New textbooks replaced outdated donor-funded curricula. Children learned about asphalt compositions, hydrology, and logistics from local examples, not European models from the 1970s. Schools organized field trips not to monuments of colonization, but to bridges under construction. The future was not being imagined, it was being visited. In popular culture, the transformation was just as visible. Films were made showing fictionalized road crews overcoming sabotage to complete routes that united families and markets. Songs topping radio charts celebrated workers, welders, and women managing roadside clinics. Fashion designers incorporated reflective safety stripes into high-end garments. The road was everywhere, in language, music, architecture, and belief. Yet, with visibility came vulnerability. Two high-profile assassination attempts on regional project managers were narrowly foiled. Investigations traced financial support to offshore accounts linked to shell NGOs registered in former colonial territories. No charges were formally filed, but the message was clear. The cost of independence was now life itself. But instead of retreating, the government responded with resilience. Road security brigades were deployed, not military forces, but trained civilian responders equipped with communication tech, trauma kits, and community mediation training. The goal was not suppression, but continuity. Every kilometer mattered. Every delay risked perception, and perception was now power. For Traoré, the stakes had evolved. This was no longer about economic planning, it was about geopolitical survival. In a closed-door address to his ministers, he said, "The road is our boundary. Each line we draw in asphalt is a line they cannot erase. Because once people have moved freely, they do not return to cages." That statement was later leaked, and it became a mantra. It was printed on t-shirts, banners, and murals. Farmers painted it on grain sacks. Truckers tattooed it on their arms. Burkina Faso was no longer building roads. It was defending the freedom those roads delivered. Every truck that passed a checkpoint, every child that rode a school bus for the first time, every mother that crossed a bridge to give birth safely, these were no longer small victories. They were proof that the future could be built without permission. And that, above all, was the revolution no institution wanted to admit was happening. As the final kilometers of the great Burkina Faso highway system neared completion, a silence spread, not from inaction, but from realization. The realization that what had once been mocked as impossible was now undeniable. The roads existed, the bridges stood, the traffic flowed. What remained was not the question of success, but of what came next. The international community, after years of quiet resistance, began recalibrating. Some foreign analysts shifted their tone from condemnation to cautious admiration. Delegations that had once declined invitations to visit Burkina Faso now requested official tours. Even longtime critics began speaking of learning from indigenous infrastructure models. But for Burkina Faso, validation was never the goal. The road wasn't built for applause. It was built because the people had waited too long. They had waited for dignity, for connection, for freedom from the grip of an economic order that had never believed in them. Now they had built it themselves. The final road inauguration was held in a village that, 2 years earlier, was reachable only by footpaths. Elders wept not because of the road's beauty, but because of its meaning. A child born that week would never know what it was like to be cut off. A grandmother who had never left her province crossed 3 cities in one day. That wasn't infrastructure. That was liberation. In his final public address before transitioning the project to local road authorities, President Traoré stood not behind a podium, but in the dust beside the highway. He said, "We did not build these roads to reach somewhere. We built them so we never again feel far from each other. So our voices are not lost in distance. So our futures are not delayed by a terrain. This is not the end of construction. It is the end of isolation." His words were not loud, but they echoed across a continent. In the following months, leaders from neighboring countries met in secret summits to study the Burkina Faso approach. Regional currencies were proposed. Joint infrastructure banks were discussed. The idea that Africans could finance, build, and sustain their own development without being reduced to risk ratings had gone from fringe to framework. And yet, for all its ambition, Burkina Faso remained vigilant. Security patrols still guarded key logistics zones. Disinformation campaigns still flickered across social platforms. Foreign pressure had not vanished. It had only mutated. But something deeper had taken root. National confidence. That confidence could not be assassinated. It could not be downgraded. It could not be frozen in overseas banks. It lived in the knowledge that a once marginalized nation had declared, "We will build," and had done exactly that. And in doing so, it had redefined power, not as domination, but as self-determination. Today, the world drives on those roads. Trucks from Mali, buses from Niger, traders from Ghana. The asphalt holds their weight not just because it is strong, but because it was laid by hands that refused to ask permission. The Burkina Faso road revolution is not a miracle. It is not a miracle because it came not from luck, but from labor, not from charity, but from clarity, not from foreign blueprints, but from local courage. And that courage, visible in every kilometer, every checkpoint, every breath of dust rising behind a moving vehicle, will not be forgotten. Because now the people know, if they can build this, they can build anything. And that knowledge, once awakened, can never again be paved over.